Hi, in today's video I'm going to be talking about updating your firmware and drivers on Ubuntu and Linux. Now I've got a Dell XPS 15 that I bought a few years ago, and for the first time after installing Ubuntu I actually opened the Ubuntu store and noticed there was a list of firmware updates that I've never seen before. I just naturally presumed wrongly that the updates would be delivered through sudo apt, an apt update. So that's actually not the case. So first of all, what I'm going to do is actually open the Ubuntu store over here. And if I come up across here once it opens in OBS, okay, I'd never open the Ubuntu store because, I install everything through the command line, but I just thought I'd have a look and see, what they're recommending for applications. And I came across to the updates tab. Come on, there we go. And there were a list of firmware updates, like going back several years, that I just never noticed because I hadn't opened the store. So what you can actually do is you can update the firmware through the Ubuntu store or on the command line. So if you're like me and you've never opened the Ubuntu store, you might want to have a look because you might have some firmware updates you haven't applied. Now the issue is that some sort of firmware updates like Intel or stuff from Dell may come through different channels. So if you're just like running like a MacBook or something, the Intel updates may be updated through apt, but if you're running something like a Dell XPS, they may not show up in apt, they may show up in this store. So what you need to do is either update using the GUI in the store or use the command line. So this is a really good article by a guy called Abhish Prakesh. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. But what you can do is update the firmware through the GUI. So if you don't like the command line, you're giving this, you've set up Ubuntu for an older relative, you'd want to use the GUI method. So you can just come into the Ubuntu store and click all the updates, and it will basically update them and prompt you to reboot the system. You can do the same thing on the command line. So this is what actually the picture looks like. On a Dell XPS, what will happen is after I'd applied all the updates and it reboots, it has a little thing saying updating your firmware, flashing updating system BIOS, and then it will reboot into the system again. So the way you do this on the command line is using something called LVFS, and basically it's where system manufacturers kind of like add this firmware to this sort of community location that you can then update. Now the fwupdate command is used for updating firmware, and it should already be installed on your system. I'm running Ubuntu 22.04 and it was automatically installed. If it's not, you may need to actually install it if you're running a older distribution, and you can do that by doing a sudo apt update and upgrade, and then sort of installing fwupd. And I didn't have to start this because it was already installed, but you may have to run sudo service fwupdate start, but you should have it automatically installed. And there's actually only two commands you need to do, and that's sudo fw. Let me put this onto another page because I've actually copied these notes across to GitHub. So all you need to do is check if there are any firmware updates available by running sudo fwupdmgr refresh. And after that, you can run the firmware update by running sudo fwupdmgr update. What that's going to do is that's going to print out some confirmations in the terminal saying, do you want to update, this firmware? Just press yes at each prompt. Then it's going to prompt you to reboot. So before you click yes for the reboot, make sure you've closed any other applications, that sort of thing. What it's then going to do is actually just go through reboot and go to that flashing screen. It will come back to a screen like this. If you're on something like a Dell, it will say updating your BIOS. If you're on something that uses Intel, like a MacBook, which don't actually have BIOS, is actually handled slightly differently. I didn't see the any firmware updates in the store for my old MacBooks, so I think those are handled differently, but it really depends on your manufacturer. So again, open the Ubuntu store, go to the Updates tab, you can click Update. That's the GUI way. Or what you can do, again, is follow this method down here by simply doing a refresh, and it's going to look like this. It's going to say fetching metadata, downloading, and then after that, you're going to apply the updates. And what it's going to do is it's actually going to give you some prompts in the terminal. Say, do you want to update this firmware? Yes or no. Just click yes, yes, yes. It's going to then give you a final prompt to reboot the system. Again, make sure you've closed all other applications. Just makes the reboot a bit more smoother. Then it's going to basically come onto the final screen where it will sort of show you the flashing of the BIOS. So that's how you update your firmware. And they said, I didn't realize it had any firmware updates at all till I opened the Ubuntu store after several years of installing Ubuntu on this Dell XPS, because I just wrongly assumed that the updates were handled in a different manner through sudo apt updates. So, you know, check the store, see if there's any updates, and either use a GUI or command line way to actually update your firmware. Now, the next thing I want to actually do is cover updating your drivers. Now, this can happen. You can need to do this after you do a fresh install. So if you've just got a new computer and you put Ubuntu on it, you want to check the drivers are updated. The other time you need to do this is if you're actually doing an upgrade between versions of Ubuntu. So, for instance, if you've upgraded from 2004 to 2204 or something like that, you're going to need to run the Ubuntu drivers update as well, because what I found was I did an update and I noticed my CPU usage while playing videos was going really high and I couldn't figure it out. I just thought it was Ubuntu 2204 being shit, but it wasn't. It was because I hadn't installed the update for the drivers. So what you want to do is open the terminal and check Ubuntu drivers-devices. So I've come across the terminal here. Let's put that full screen. Yeah, bastard. Okay, doesn't want to paste. Right, there we go. Ubuntu drivers devices. And what this should do, okay, OBS is being a bit funny. Okay, so I'm going to put this in a window because OBS seems to pick it up a bit better. So what you're going to see is after you've run Ubuntu drivers devices, you're going to see a list of various versions of the devices that you can use. Now I'm running, as you can see here, a GeForce GTX 1650 mobile Nvidia graphics card. There's two drivers for the Nvidia graphics card. There's the open source Nouveau driver, and there's the proprietary driver that I'm using. And there's a difference because some applications will require you to use the proprietary driver to be able to use them. For instance, DaVinci Resolve, which is a video editor, uses hardware acceleration and CUDA, and that requires you to have the proprietary driver. Now, the other issue with the drivers is it's also going to determine what desktop environment, or not so much desktop environment, but tiling window manager can use. So if you want to use Sway on Wayland with Nvidia, you have to use a Nouveau driver, which is actually slower than the proprietary driver. So that's the reason why I'm actually running GNOME, is because the proprietary Nvidia drivers won't work with Sway or some other tiling window managers. So that's how you get a list of the drivers. And what you can do is you can either select a driver to manually install, or you can do an auto install and it will automatically install the latest version for you. So what you do is you run sudo ubuntu drivers auto install, and that's going to install the recommended driver. If you wanted to specifically install a certain driver, you can run something like sudo apt install Nvidia driver -455, which was one of these drivers listed down here. Well, I don't think it's listed down there anymore. Maybe I made an error and it was 450, but the latest is 515. Now, the other thing that you're going to need to do is if you're going to use the proprietary Nvidia driver, you need to blacklist the Nouveau Nvidia driver. And the way you do that is by creating a text file in etc modprobe.d called blacklist-nvidia-nouveau.conf. And inside that file, what you do is you have these two lines: blacklist Nouveau and options Nouveau mode set equals 0. Now, once you've created that file, what you need to do is update init rams fs. So you run sudo update -init ram fs-u, and what that does is that builds the init init. You know, sometimes when you do an update saying like rebuilding init frams, and basically that's what it does. It updates stuff, and then what you do is you run a sudo reboot. That's going to reboot the system, and then finally what you can do is you can check the GPU information and processes that you're using on your Nvidia GPU with Nvidia-SMI, or you can actually open the Nvidia settings, which I think you have to do with sudo. So you can run sudo Nvidia settings, and in the settings you can actually select which card you're doing. So you might have like two things you can switch between Intel and Nvidia. So you can actually select using your graphics card more power, sudo prime select Nvidia, or Intel, more power efficient. And you note a reboot is needed after running each of these commands to take effect. So I'm not sure how those differ from, for instance, if I come across to the settings, come on, OBS. For instance, up here under battery balanced, what you see is you've got like performance, balance, power savings, and power settings. I'm not sure how those differ from these settings, because I think you can just change these settings without rebooting, and you can come into the power settings here, and this affects the system performance and power usage. So I'm not sure how these commands here, switching directly to the graphics card, are different from selecting stuff in the GUI from the drop down menu. But if you do it on the command line, basically you need to do a reboot. So that's how you update your firmware and drivers, and make sure you do that because it's really easy to miss. I actually missed it for several years. I said, first time I'd opened the store, I came across, had a look, updates for all these drivers and firmware. So I closed the store, ran a sudo update, apt update, thinking, oh, maybe, these have just come in and I hadn't noticed. But they were still there, and I was baffled, because I just hadn't opened the store to see the drivers update, because, you'd think it would be, I don't know, you'd think they'd put it in a different section. So basically what I did was had a look at that article over there on It's FOSS by Abhish Prakash, basically showing you how to update the firmware. So easy way, if you know, you don't want to mess about with the command line. You could do it through the GUI, but sometimes, you know, if a GUI application is a bit flaky, you know, it might crash or stop partway through. So I always prefer to use the command line. I'm not saying this is going to crash or anything, but I just always feel safer doing these things through the command line. But you know, this is a nice, easy way to do it. Or, as I said, you can basically do it using fw up, and that should be installed by default. And again, there's only actually two commands you need to do. Run sudo fwupdmgr refresh. It's going to download the latest stuff, and then you do a sudo fwupdmgr update. That will then give you a list of prompts to agree to, and you just say, yeah, I want to install, you know, the updates for the firmware. Prompt you to reboot. When it's done rebooting, you'll get the flashing screen. Make sure you've got the power plugged in so it doesn't crap out. Once it's done flashing the latest firmware, it will reboot into the system. And again, on the so that was the firmware. So literally, there's only two commands you need to do. Just come across, copy that, paste that in terminal. Once that's done, do the update, and you know, follow prompts and reboot, and you're done. Now the drivers, again, two times you need to do this. When you do a fresh install, make sure to run the Ubuntu drivers devices command. I think they may be I'm not sure if there's another software updates. Is it software? Oh, there's the additional drivers thing. Yeah. So is that the additional drivers thing? Yeah. So this is the additional drivers. Yeah. So software and updates, additional drivers. That's showing the you know, the drivers, basically the Nvidia drivers. So it does show up under additional software, additional drivers. You can choose that. But again, I prefer to use the command line. So easiest thing to do is just sudo ubuntu drivers auto install. That's going to install the recommended drivers. Or you can pick a specific driver if you want. And again, if you're using Nvidia, remember you're going to need to blacklist the Nouveau driver. I think the Nouveau driver was created by sort of reverse engineering the Nvidia drivers, so it's not as efficient as the Nvidia driver, which can be required for certain applications like DaVinci Resolve. I think there's also an issue. The Nouveau driver may support the nightlight, whereas the proprietary driver doesn't. So if I just switch back across here a second to the desktop, go on. So under here, what you'll see is my connection, the screen is being shared, fully charged, balanced. I thought there was a nightlight section under here. Maybe it's not showing up because I haven't got it activated. So if you come under, is it displays, screen display? Nightlight. So up here you'll see nightlight, and you can turn this on and it will, you know, give you a less bright screen at night. But I think the nightlight only works with the Nouveau driver, not the Nvidia proprietary driver. So there are some issues if you're using a proprietary driver, and there's some issues if you're using the Nouveau driver. If you're using the proprietary driver for Nvidia, you can't use Sway on Wayland. You're using the Nouveau driver, you can't use applications like DaVinci Resolve. So there are issues, pros and cons for each, but I'd recommend using the proprietary driver. And if that's the case, then what you're going to do is need to blacklist the Nouveau Nvidia driver. And again, you do that by creating the file etc modprobe.d blacklist-nvidia-nouveau.conf. Add these two lines to that file, save it, update the inframs, do a reboot, Once you've done that, you should be able to run the Nvidia SMI command to see the processes that are being used by your Nvidia GPU, and you can also open the Nvidia settings. So that's how you update your firmware and drivers on Ubuntu and Linux. And again, it's really easy to miss this, and I did miss this, both the firmware update and actually the updating the drivers. So the times you may need to update the drivers, when you do a fresh install of Ubuntu, it's always a good idea to check the recommended drivers. But also what I found is after you're updating between versions, like if you update from Ubuntu 20.04 to 22.04, run the Ubuntu drivers devices again and do the auto install, because I made a mistake and didn't do that, and suddenly noticed MPV usage was going through the roof when playing videos, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Did a search around on Ubuntu 22.04. No one else was having that problem, which meant it was obviously something to do with my system. Checked the drivers, and there was an update. So I did the update, rebooted, and the CPU usage dropped. So make sure to update your firmware. Really easy to update your firmware. A little bit more involved to update your drivers for things like Nvidia. But it's a good idea just to double check, and open the store, come across, check, see if there's any updates listed for firmware, because it's really easy to miss, and it will help protect you against things like those Spectre attacks and all those things like that. So there may be a difference between updates for different hardware. So again, this article is basically mentioning Ubuntu provides updates for all supported hardware through various channels. Some firmware updates come from the manufacturer, like Intel, or some come from the community. That's what I've seen with my Dell XPS. So I can confirm that. I've tried doing this both on an Intel machine, an old MacBook Air 2011, 4 gig of RAM, and it didn't show up in the store. Whereas on the Dell XPS, which does have a BIOS, there were updates that I had to apply, and it went seamlessly. It's really easy to do, and it's easy to miss. As I said, I missed it for several years. We're all human. I make mistakes like everyone else. I'm not inflammable. It's a joke. So it's easy to do. It may be slightly different on other distributions that obviously don't have an Ubuntu store, but I presume they're going to be using the same command down here to check your firmware. So if you're on another Linux distribution, have a look at the fwup UPD commands, and once that's running, you can run sudo fwupdmgr refresh to refresh the list of firmware updates. And then all you need to do is run sudo fwupdmgr update. So I put links to all this under the video, and I've put these notes up on GitHub, so you don't have to see adverts or a website like that. You can just come in, copy the commands, paste them in the terminal, and you're done. And again, same thing for the recommended drivers. It's easy to miss. You may have done an upgrade of Ubuntu, as I said, from 20.04 to 22.04 or whatever, and notice the performance has suddenly dropped. Your CPU usage has gone up, and you can't figure it out. Check that there aren't any additional drivers after you've done the update, because as I said, sudo apt update and upgrade doesn't upgrade. It may not, depending on your manufacturer, that sort of thing, may not update your drivers and your firmware. So you may need to do it manually by following these instructions. The other thing that you may that needs to be updated. I'm going to put this snap manually. Sometimes is snaps. Where did I put this? Yeah, there's a snap. Let me just see if I filed it under snap. So basically what I do is I keep all these tips on GitHub under this repo here. So let me just check if I haven't filed this under snap, which I think I may have done, as opposed to sticking it under Ubuntu. And snap, yeah, there we go, snap refresh. So this is another command that you need to run outside of apt, So what I'm doing here is I'm using doas. You can use sudo instead. Doas is a simple alternative to sudo. But what you do, sometimes you may have noticed you're using, if you've installed Firefox or Chrome on Ubuntu, they're going to be installed as snaps. And sometimes what you'll find is you get like a little big pop-up saying, you need to, something like close Firefox, there's going to be an update, that sort of thing. You close Firefox, and what you'd think would happen is that it would automatically update once you've done that, but it doesn't. What happens is with snaps, they update 4 times a day, I think it is. And it will say, it's going to update in, 8 hours or something. But what you can do is actually list the packages and then force an update. So to list the snap packages, what we do, come on terminal. So sometimes there's a bit of a lag with OBS. Okay. So we run, as you see here, either doas snap refresh -- list or sudo snap refresh -- list. If there are any updates, it will give you a list of updates. It will say like pending. And let me just get some more tea. Now to force an update, come on, there we go. What you can do is run sudo or doas snap refresh Firefox. So make sure Firefox or Chromium are closed, and then do a sudo snap refresh Firefox or Chromium, and it will update. It will give you a little progress bar, and it will update, and then you can open Firefox or Chromium again, and it will be updated. So that's another thing that's not handled by apt, is actually forcing the updates of snap packages. As I said, by default, I think what happens is they check 4 times a day to see if there's an update. And again, what you may find is you're using Firefox or Chromium installed as a snap package. You'll get a big notification saying, pending update in 13 hours or something, close Firefox or Chromium. So you close it and you think it's going to update, and it doesn't. So this is how you get around that, is to force the update. The other thing is, maybe you're browsing the web and you say, oh yeah, Firefox 105 or 106 out. What will happen is you won't get it straight away because it's checking every couple of hours. You may have to wait a couple of hours for that update to come through. But you can force the update to get the latest version straight away. So run the snap refresh -- list. You should see Firefox 106 or 107 or whatever it is. And then just run sudo snap refresh Firefox or doas, and it's going to download the latest version, and you're good to go. So that's another reason. You may be browsing something like OMG Ubuntu. You see, oh yeah, there's new Firefox out with these great new features. You really want to get it straight away that second. Just do a snap refresh and the application name, and it's going to download the latest version. So those are a couple of things that aren't actually handled by apt and apt update and apt upgrade. That's your firmware, your drivers, and your snaps. So it's easy to miss some of these things. So have a check. make sure you can either check on the command line if there's any firmware updates, or if you want to use the command line, just open the Ubuntu store. You can see it like that. Just click the update buttons, reboot, you're good to go. Check your drivers, and again, if you want to check, force the latest update of a snap package, that's how you do it. So I'll put links to all this under the video. Hope that helps you out, and it's really easy to miss. And as I said, I missed the firmware updates for several years because I just simply never opened the Snap the Ubuntu store, because why would I? And again, the other thing that's really easy to miss is actually updating your drivers, either when you do a new install or after you've done an upgrade. So I'd recommend install Ubuntu, on another computer, for a relative or whatever. Before you give it to them, make sure you check that all the drivers are updated and all the firmware is updated, because it will just give them less hassle having to manually update stuff, and you don't have to deal with tech support saying why is the computer running so hot and why the fan's kicking in whenever I play a video. Maybe because the drivers haven't been updated. So what I'd recommend is, if you ever do an upgrade or clean install, check the firmware's updated, check the drivers are updated. And again, the other thing that you can do is force snap updates as well, because as I said, by default it checks a couple of times a day, and if you want to force the update and get it straight away, you can do, and that's how you do it. So I'll put links to all this under the video and hope that helps out.